Hello. In this lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 11, Artistic Styles in the Emerging Modern World, circa 1400 to 1800. Now again, like the previous chapter, this is a large chunk of time. We're going to go about 400 years, and a lot of things happened within this time period. So again, we are mainly going to hit the highlights and focus on the Western world. But just like in the other chapters, we will start with the context so we get an idea of what's going on in the world. So in Europe, we have some major events in this time period. We have the Renaissance from 1400 to about 1550, and we'll discuss this in more detail later on. But what happens with the Renaissance? We're moving out of the Middle Ages, out of the Gothic. And what happens is we have a rebirth in the understanding of human beings. And what happens is that those texts of ancient Greece and Rome that had been lost during the Middle Ages make their way back over to the Western world. And because of this, we're going to see this new resurgence in the interest in the role of man. This largely centered in Florence. In fact, Florence called itself the New Athens. And the role of man changed from what we saw in the Middle Ages. Remember, the Middle Ages, there was the claim that the mortal world was this vale of tears that man must suffer through to get to the salvation of the afterlife. Well, the Renaissance, that idea changed, and man starts to focus more on himself. And in this, we see the rise of what's called humanism. And this is the focus on human potential and not a focus on divine inspiration. Some important inventions during the time is we have Gutenberg's movable type printing press in 1450, which makes printed materials much more readily available to more people. This is also a time of exploration. In 1497, the Cape of Good Hope is rounded. In 1492, Columbus discovers the Americas. And in 1522, Magellan circumnavigates the globe. Then we move on to what's called the Reformation and then the Counter-Reformation. This begins the Protestant Reformation in about 1517, and this began with the posting of Martin Luther's 95 Theses. And what happens here is it's reflecting the culture of the time, this eroding faith in both the Catholic Church and the role of the Pope. And we'll talk about this again in more detail. The Counter-Reformation, this was actually the church's response, trying to get people back into the church. And then we have the Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason. This is about the later 1600s into the 1800s, into the time period of Romanticism. Here we're going to see man moving even further away from the church. This is the time of the scientific revolution. It is the time of the Industrial Revolution. The idea of natural law develops, and this is that there are rules that govern the world, and some that they were an inherent part of the earth, such as like gravity, things such as this. During the Enlightenment, we'll talk about moving from a geocentric universe to a heliocentric universe. In Asia and China, this is a time of great prosperity under the Ming Dynasty from 1368 to 1644. The government provided public works that helped many citizens. This includes water, jobs, roadways, and it was a time of great stability in China. However, it did eventually end by rebellion. In India, for the 16th and 17th century, it was ruled by the Mughals, who were the Mongolian descents of Muslims. India also enjoyed a time of political stability and flourishing economic activity, leading to a flourishing artistic climate at the time. In India, there were attempts to widen the empire by the aristocracy, and these were unsuccessful and put much stress on the peasants, and eventually leading to unrest. In Japan in the 17th century, we're going to see the rise of the samurai. This was a warrior class who became a higher class serving important roles. And then in Japan, the population actually tripled to over 30 million individuals. In 18th century, the Japanese society became much more urban, and we saw a strong middle class that developed. Most of these were merchants. And then also at this time, we saw the arts flourishing. And this is the time period where we're going to see the rise of the kabuki theater. And then in Africa, we're starting to see a rise in the European presence. We're going to see a clash between Christians and Muslims, all fighting for control of this area. And then this is also where we're going to see the beginning and the rise of the slave trade. And then with the discovery of the Americas in 1492, this idea of this new world. However, we all know from history, this wasn't a new world. There were people there at the beginning. In the 16th century, the Spanish dominated the area. The Aztec Empire, which was a dominant force, it would not form alliances with others. They believed they were the chosen people. And this is also the time of the Incan Empire. And these were both eventually destroyed by the Spaniards. All right, so for this lecture, these are the different artistic styles you'll need to know. The early Renaissance, High Renaissance, Mannerism, Baroque, and the Enlightenment. And within the Enlightenment, we'll look at two artistic styles, the Rococo and the Neoclassical. So let's start with the early Renaissance. What we're going to see again in the early Renaissance, this starts about 1400 and it centers in Florence, Italy. And what we're going to see is we're going to see that painting actually begins to flourish with the development of more realistic tools. And we're going to see that in the work here. This is Boccaccio's The Tribute Money, created 1425. It's a fresco in the Untitled Chapel. And what we're going to see here is this much more realistic details within the works, that we're going to see the use of space and perspective to make works look three-dimensional. So here, when you look at this, this is showing a scene of part of the cycle of life of St. Peter. And what we see here with this group of men, this is Jesus and the apostles, how they're standing is much more realistically than we would have seen in the Middle Ages. Think about it this way. If you're standing and looking at a group of individuals, you're not able to clearly see everybody. Well, in the Middle Ages, there had been a practice which was called stacking. And this is where if people were like one standing behind another, instead of showing them realistically, the person behind would kind of be up on top. And that way you could see everybody. Well, what happens in the Renaissance is we see this shift towards this more realistic perspective. Also, we can see the use of atmospheric perspective in the background. You can see we know the mountains are supposed to be further away because they're smaller, they're out of focus. And then you can also see the foreshortening on the right-hand side in the building. This is a technique used in perspective to create the illusion of an object receding very strongly into the distance or the background. So we know from where we're standing, our vantage point, we know this building is going away from us. Also, the individuals are much more lifelike. The clothes, how they're standing in contrapposto, and the figures stand in a more realistic semicircular and not in the straight line, or again the stacking that was popular in the medieval works. Now, what we also see within the tribute money, is this is actually three scenes in one. This is from, again, the life cycle of St. Peter. And what we see here is the story where the apostles are going and they want to go into the temple. However, you have to pay a tax or a tribute to get into the temple, and they don't have the money. So in the middle scene, we see Jesus, the central figure, and he is telling, you see the tax collector basically saying, I need the money. And Jesus telling St. Peter, go over to the water, catch a fish, and then open its mouth. So then if you look over to the left, you see St. Peter in the water, and he's catching a fish. Well, when he catches the fish and opens the mouth, there's a coin inside. And then so the image on the right-hand side is St. Peter actually paying the tribute money so they can go into the temple. Now, not all works in the early Renaissance were concerned with realistic representations. And you can see that here. This is Botticelli's La Primavera, or the Spring, from 1482. And again, this one is not as worried or concerned with a realistic perspective. Here we can see the figures have strong outlines. But what is he doing here is he's actually using the use of allegory. And so what the use of allegory is that you're showing one thing, yet it's telling a separate story. So here we're seeing La Primavera, which would be the ancient Greek or Roman representation of spring, yet it's also telling a story of the life of Mary. All right, well then probably the most important invention of the Renaissance is in the 15th century, Flemish painters developed oil paint. This radically changed the painting world because it helped painters to achieve realism and perspective unlike anything in the Gothic era. The reason why this happens is that Oil paints actually dry much slower. In fact, if you work with oil paints, they take forever to dry. But because of this, the slow drying period, artists were able to blend and make very bold and bright colors, and they were able to create very fine details, which they were unable to do with the mediums before. Flemish painters used this to enhance chiaroscuro, and it also helped develop more atmospheric perspective. And now we're also going to see this changing role of the view of the artist. An example of this is the image we're seeing here. This is Jan van Eyck's The Arnolfini Marriage, or Giovanni Arnolfini and His Bride. This is from 1434. And it's an oil on panel. And you can see here it's created using the oil paint. So we have very bold, bright colors we've not seen before, and then the finite details that are available in this. And what happens is, I made mention last time that in the Middle Ages, we actually really didn't even keep track of who the artists were. Why? Because they were just the tool, right? The works were the divine inspiration. However, what's happening now is artists and man is getting credit for creativity. And what we see here, this is actually a marriage between the two individuals. And there's a lot of message and meaning in this work itself. The Arnolfinis, he was a wealthy merchant, and we're going to see that in the Renaissance, this rise of this middle class, this merchant class. And so what you see here, again, because usually only the wealthy could purchase portraits to be made. So having this portrait created is showing their status and their wealth. And you can see that through different things throughout it. You can see the shoes on the lower left-hand side, which would represent travel. You can look at their clothing. His cloak, right, it's lined with fur. Her dress, very extravagant detail. And no, she is not pregnant. This actually was the style of the time. And in fact, women would pad that area of themselves to get this silhouette. We can also see, if you look in the window sill and right below, there's oranges. This would be something very hard to come by. So again, it's showing the wealth of the individuals. In the background, you're going to see there's a canopy bed. Now, most people would think, okay, so this means this painting is done in their bedroom. It's actually not. Canopy beds were, again, a sign of wealth, and so this was something people at the time would actually put these canopy beds in their living room, if you will, just to show off the wealth. And then you can see the chandelier, very highly decorated and ornate. And then the dog. And interestingly enough, dogs, when they are represented in paintings, usually mean loyalty and fidelity, especially when they're painted with a female. And that's why we see this, if this is a marriage contract, right? It's showing that loyalty and fidelity. Now, also interesting in this is what we call a double portrait. So when you look in the mirror in the back, if you zoom in, you actually we see the backs of the individuals as they are represented, but we also see Jan van Eyck himself in the painting, and it's showing him painting the painting. And then if you look right above the mirror, you also see these words. And the words literally translate to Jan van Eyck was here 1434. And so this is very important because it's looking at the changing role of the artist. The artist is no longer just the skilled technician to create the work, but here we actually see the artist as a witness to this event. All right, this is also the time of Albrecht Dürer. He was a German artist. We've looked at some of his prints. You'll see more in the two-dimensional chapter. But this is an example. This is a woodcut. It's the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse from 1497 to 98. And here we still see some of those medieval superstition, right? The myth of the Four Horsemen. Yet, this is also making a political commentary. So you see the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, and look at who they're stampeding, right? They're stampeding and running over the people. However, if you look on the bottom left, he's also making a comment about the fall of the church, because death is actually trampling over the bishop. Okay? And we know these works are Albrecht Dürer's. If you look in the bottom, in the center, you see the AD. That was his signature. You'll find that in all of his engravings and his woodcuts. All right, and then sculpture at the time. Sculpture, again, focused around the 15th century Florence. And what we're going to see in early Renaissance works is, again, this drive for things to be as lifelike, as human-like as possible, or as realistic. So unlike that Greek goal of perfection showing the idealized man, early Renaissance sculptures wanted to represent the individuals. Here we're going to see freestanding statues become popular again. And here what we're looking at, this is Donatello's David. And this was actually the first freestanding sculpture in centuries. And what we have here is with this David, he looks different than other Davids we may know. Why? Because like that the early Renaissance, he's trying to show David as he actually was. And in the biblical story, David is actually represented, is described as a beautiful youth. That's why when you look at this David, he seems much more feminine, not as much muscle tone, because he's supposed to be a younger individual. The other image we see here is Lorenzo Ghiberti's. These are the gates of paradise. These were the doors that were originally for the baptistry in Florence. And each is a relief panel that tells a story, and then it's also surrounded by important figures. Again, just like in Maccaccio's The Tribute Money, you're going to see the perspective and the realisticness is much more lifelike within these. All right, we do have literature at the time. Again, this is an imitation of much of the classics, and we talk about classics, we're talking about the Greek and Roman classics that are making their way back to the Western world. Also very interesting at the time is the text here. This is Castiglione's The Book of the Courtier. And what happened is we have a monarchy government, and the lives of Renaissance men and women were that of the courtiers, and this is the upper classes. And basically, you've probably heard the term being a Renaissance man. Well, that means that a Renaissance individual should not just be trained in one area, but you should be well trained in many areas. The arts, literature, dance, you should be able to easily converse on a wide variety of subjects. And what happens in the Book of the Courtier is this was basically a guide of good manners and conversations, but it also reflected the Renaissance ideals of intellectual refinement, moral stability, cultural grace, and spiritual insight and social consciousness. And then the architecture at the time. This differed from medieval architecture in three main ways. First, we're going to see the revival of classical models, again referring back to ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And then we're going to see the application of non-structural decorative details. Think of the Gothic cathedrals. The flying buttresses were very beautiful, yet they were structural details. And what we're going to see here is when we look, this is again the Florence Cathedral, the bottom left images we're looking up in the dome, and that dome is painted. This is just purely decoration. And then the third way is the outer expression. Again, we are going to see that that stability and support that was needed by the flying buttresses is going to go away. The Renaissance architects found a way to hide the supporting elements, so the external appearance was also very beautiful. An example of this is the dome here, Filippino Brunelleschi's Florence Cathedral Dome, which we talked about in the What is Creativity lecture.